I was standing in the kitchen when I heard a heavy sound echoing from the lake behind the house. A dull, hollow thump, unlike anything familiar I had ever heard. When I stepped out onto the porch, my daughter-in-law's car was speeding away through a cloud of dust, the trunk still wide open. On the surface of the lake, something dark was tilting, rising and sinking very slowly, as if there were air trapped inside it. I didn't know what it was. I only knew it was too heavy to be thrown away casually, and too rushed to ignore without looking back. I stood frozen for a few seconds, then heard a very faint sound, not clearly water sloshing, not clearly anything else, just something being pressed from the inside. I ran down to the lake, not because I was certain, but because if I had turned my back at that moment, I probably would have never slept peacefully again for the rest of my life. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Ilara Whitcomb, 64 years old. I live alone in an old wooden house right beside a small crater lake on the southern edge of Oregon, where winters are long, summers are quiet, and people my age are often advised to slow down. Slow down. I had been slowing down for 7 months, ever since the day they called me at 3 a.m. and told me my son, Nathaniel, had died in a car accident on the highway. I don't remember how long I sat motionless in the kitchen that day. I only remember the steady ticking of the wall clock and how cold the coffee pot on the stove had become. So cold that when I touched it, I flinched from the chill. Nathaniel was my only child. I gave birth to him when I was 39, an age when doctors looked at me with concern back then. But Nathaniel came into my life like a late blessing, and I spent nearly the rest of my life revolving around him. He grew up by this lake. He fished with me from the old wooden dock. He sat on the porch reading books on summer afternoons. And then he grew up, moved away, studied mechanical engineering in Portland, and married Lysanne, the woman who, from the first moment I met her, gave me a feeling I never quite knew how to name. Not dislike, not exactly suspicion, just cold. Lysanne was always polite, too polite. Her smile was always measured, her voice always controlled, her eyes always seemed to be calculating something behind them. I never had proof that she was a bad person, but I also never once felt truly at ease around her. After Nathaniel's funeral, the relationship between Lysanne and me nearly froze solid. She came to my house exactly twice to collect her husband's belongings. The first time, she was silent. The second time, irritated. Not a single question, not a single tear. Then she disappeared from my life, just as Nathaniel had disappeared from this world, until that afternoon. I stood on the porch, watching Lysanne's car vanish down the winding dirt road. My heart was pounding so hard my ears rang. An open trunk is not a small thing. No one drives with their trunk open unless they are panicked, or in such a rush they don't bother checking behind them. I turned back toward the lake. The object had drifted a little farther out, but it hadn't fully sunk yet. It didn't float upright like a log, and it wasn't flat like an empty container. It tilted awkwardly, heavy as if struggling between staying afloat and being pulled under. A light breeze rippled the water, and then I heard that sound again. Not clearly, not loud enough to be called a cry, just something faint, like air being forced through a narrow gap. My heart clenched. Ilara, you're imagining things, I told myself. At my age, it's easy to let your mind run wild. I had lost my son. I lived alone. I heard a noise, saw a suitcase, and my brain immediately tried to connect everything into a horrifying story. But my hand stayed locked around the porch railing. I looked around. No one. No birds. No engine noise anymore. Just the lake and that dark object. I called out Lysanne's name. Lysanne. My voice sounded weak in the empty air. No answer. I called again, louder. Lysanne. Still nothing. I stepped off the porch. The wet grass made my shoes slip slightly. My legs were shaking. I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from a fear that hadn't fully taken shape yet. When I reached the water's edge, I realized the object was no longer drifting. It was starting to sink, little by little, slowly but surely. Without thinking further, I hiked up my skirt and stepped into the lake. The water was brutally cold, soaking through my thin socks, biting into my skin like needles. I gasped, trying to keep my balance. The mud beneath the surface was soft and slick, making every step difficult. When my hand touched the object, I shuddered. Leather, not metal, not plastic. Leather, a suitcase. Dark leather, old, its surface wrinkled from the water. It was unbearably heavy. I had to use both hands, straining to pull it toward shore. My shoulders screamed with pain. My back felt like it might snap. No, 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 I muttered, not even sure what I was pleading for. Then I heard it, clearer than before. A very small sound, very weak, like someone inhaling, then not having the strength to exhale. I almost let go. My heart raced wildly. My throat burned dry. I dragged the suitcase onto the shore, letting it rest on the wet gravel. Water streamed out through the seams. I knelt in front of it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the zipper. "Elara, stay calm," I whispered to myself. "You don't know anything yet." But I did, not logically, instinctively. I pulled the zipper. It stuck. I yanked harder. It tore open with a harsh screech. The smell hit me first, dampness, lake water, and something else. Something I recognized from years ago when I was a young mother, the smell of milk. The suitcase opened. In that moment, my world stopped. Inside was a newborn baby, wrapped in a thin blanket soaked through. Its skin was pale. Its lips were blue. Its eyes were tightly shut. So small it felt like my heart was being crushed. I reached out and touched its chest. Cold. Far too cold. I pressed my ear down. At first, I heard nothing. 1 second, 2, then a faint breath. Almost non-existent. But there. "Oh my God," I gasped, tears spilling uncontrollably. "No, this can't be." I lifted the baby. It was so light it terrified me, like I was holding something that could disappear at any moment if I loosened my grip. I stood up, unsteady. My legs ached, but I felt none of it. I knew only one thing. This child was still alive. The baby was so light that I was afraid if I breathed too hard, it would dissolve in my arms. I stood frozen for a few seconds by the lake, my mind blank, but I didn't faint the way I always imagined someone would in a situation this horrifying. Maybe because the fear was too specific, too real for my body to allow collapse. I didn't have that right. Not now. I pulled the wet blanket tighter around the baby and pressed it against my chest. The small, freezing body against my clothes made me shiver, but it also snapped me back into reality. It was breathing, weakly, unevenly, but breathing. That alone was enough to make me start running. I don't remember exactly how I ran from the lake back to the house. I only remember gravel cutting into my feet, wet grass clinging to my skirt, and my heartbeat pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. I didn't dare look too closely at the baby's face. I was afraid if I did, I would see something that would steal my courage. So I focused on the path ahead, each step, each familiar stretch of ground leading back to the old wooden house. When I pushed open the kitchen door, the room felt terrifyingly quiet. The wall clock was still ticking steadily, as if the world had no idea a life was hanging by a thread. I set the baby down on the kitchen table and swept everything aside. Dishes, old newspapers, a dried flower vase, everything clattered to the floor. I didn't care. I just needed a flat surface. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to take several deep breaths before I could dial the phone. I called 911. Part of me was afraid I wouldn't be able to speak, that my voice would break into meaningless sounds. But when the calm voice of the dispatcher came on the line, something in me latched onto that steadiness like a lifeline. 911, what is your emergency? I found a baby, I said, my voice rough. A newborn. It was in the water. It's very cold. Where are you located? The voice asked, not raising her tone. I gave my address slowly, carefully, as if saying a single word wrong would cause everything to collapse. I heard typing on the other end. An ambulance is being dispatched, she said. Now I need you to follow my instructions, okay? I nodded instinctively, then realized she couldn't see me. Okay, I said. Please, hurry. Place the baby on a dry, flat surface, she instructed. If the clothes are wet, remove as much as possible and use dry towels to dry the baby. Do you have towels? I looked around as if my familiar kitchen had suddenly become foreign. Yes, I said, then ran to the bathroom, grabbing every clean towel I could find. I rushed back, knelt by the table, and began drying the baby with movements that were clumsy and desperate. Its skin was so cold I had to bite my lip to keep from sobbing. I wiped its chest, its tiny arms like fragile twigs, its little legs. I was afraid of hurting it, but even more afraid that if I was too gentle, I wouldn't warm it in time. Wrap the baby in dry towels, as many layers as possible, the dispatcher said. Keep the baby warm. Hold the baby against your body if you can. I did exactly that, pressing the baby to my chest, using what little warmth my aging body could offer. I bent my head down, pressed my cheek to its forehead, cold, but not as icy as at the lake. I listened for its breathing, counting each breath like counting the last seconds of time. It's breathing, I said, more to reassure myself than anyone else. Very weak. That's good, she replied. Keep doing what you're doing. The ambulance will arrive in a few minutes. A few minutes. Just a few minutes. But to me, they stretched into a lifetime. I sat on the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, the baby cradled in my arms. I began to rock gently, instinctively, a slow rhythm I didn't realize I still remembered. I whispered sounds that weren't really words, just soft murmurs, as if I were speaking directly to my own heart. Don't give up, I whispered, not sure who I was speaking to. Please, don't give up. The ambulance siren sounded in the distance, faint at first, then growing louder. When I heard it, a surge of strength rushed through me. I stood, unsteady, walked to the door, and flung it open as if they could see me from the road. Red and blue lights flickered against the old pine trees, reflecting off the lake behind the house. 2 paramedics rushed in, one middle-aged man with graying hair and a younger woman with her hair pulled back neatly. They looked at me, then at the baby in my arms, and their expressions changed instantly. Here, I said, my voice suddenly small. I found the baby in the lake. The woman gently took the baby from my arms. The way she held it made my chest ache and ease at the same time. Professional, firm, but never rough. The man opened his medical bag, pulling out equipment and a thermal blanket. Severe hypothermia, he said after a quick check. Signs of water aspiration. I stood there with empty arms, feeling as if the one thing keeping me upright had been taken away. I wanted to ask everything. Whether the baby would live, whether they could save it. But my throat locked tight, no words coming out. Would you like to come with us? The man asked, looking straight at me. I nodded immediately. Yes, I'm coming. They placed the baby on a small stretcher, wrapped it in a warming blanket, and fitted an oxygen mask. I followed them out, climbing into the ambulance with shaking legs. Inside, the lights were bright, the smell of antiseptic sharp. Machines hummed steadily, cold, clinical sounds, but strangely, they made me less afraid. Here, at least, there was order. There was process. There was hope. The ambulance started moving, the siren wailing through the early night. I sat on the side bench, my hands clasped tightly together, staring at the baby lying amid wires and machines. It looked smaller than ever, as if a strong gust of wind could carry it away. "What is your relation to the baby?" the woman asked, watching the monitor while adjusting the oxygen mask. I opened my mouth, then stopped. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what I was to this child. I'm the one who found the baby," I said finally. She nodded and didn't ask anything else. The ambulance sped through familiar roads leading into town. I looked out the window at closed shops and houses sunk into darkness. Other people's lives were continuing as usual, while mine had just turned onto a path I had never prepared for. When the ambulance stopped in front of the hospital, everything moved very fast. The rear doors opened, cold air rushed in. The baby was wheeled out and I followed, almost running. The emergency department doors swung open, harsh white lights making me squint. "NICU," someone said. "Prepare the NICU." I was held back in the hallway as they pushed the stretcher through the automatic doors. I tried to keep looking, tried to memorize every detail. The blanket, the tiny mask, the little hand, as if turning away would make the baby disappear. The doors closed in front of me. I stood there alone in the long, cold hallway, and for the first time since I heard that dull splash by the lake, I allowed myself to shake with fear. The NICU doors shut, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. I stood there for a long time, until a nurse passing by gently touched my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I nodded out of habit, though I wasn't sure what okay even meant anymore. My hands were still shaking, not from the cold now, but from the feeling that I had been yanked out of a familiar reality and thrown into another world where I had no control over anything. I was led into a small waiting room next to the emergency department. Gray plastic chairs, white walls, the sharp smell of disinfectant seeping into every breath. I sat down, my hands clasped tightly together to keep them from trembling. In my mind, images of the baby kept appearing and fading, like a skipping film reel. Cold skin, weak breathing, the steady beeping of machines in the ambulance. I tried to cling to one concrete detail so I wouldn't drift into panic. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 people entered the room. One was a police officer in his 40s, his face serious but not cold. The other was a younger woman holding a thin folder. They introduced themselves and sat across from me. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the man said, his voice low and steady. "We need to take your statement about what happened tonight." I nodded. I had expected this. I knew the moment I called 911, my life would no longer be quiet. I just hadn't expected it to happen so fast while my hands were still shaking. I told them everything from the beginning. I didn't leave out a single detail I could remember. The sound from the lake, Lysanne's car, the trunk wide open, the dark object on the water, the faint noise. I spoke slowly, carefully, as if talking too fast might make the story slip out of my grasp. "Are you certain it was Lysanne's car?" the woman asked, her eyes never leaving her notebook. "Absolutely," I replied. "I've seen that car countless times. I couldn't mistake it." "Did you see the license plate clearly?" I shook my head. "No, the car was moving too fast, but I clearly saw the trunk was open." The man wrote something down, then looked up. "Did you see Lysanne herself? Her face?" I hesitated for a second. "No, I only saw the car, but it was her car." The room fell silent for a few seconds. I felt a subtle shift in the air, not outright doubt, but a cautious step backward. The woman closed her notebook and studied me more closely. "Do you know where Lysanne is right now?" "No," I said. I haven't spoken to her since my son's funeral." Hearing Nathaniel's name spoken aloud made my throat tighten. The man nodded, his expression softening slightly. "We understand this is a major shock," he said, "but we need to verify some details." He stood up and stepped out of the room. I didn't know where he went. I only knew that I suddenly felt abandoned on a chair that was too hard, in a room that was too bright. The woman stayed, watching me with an expression that wasn't unfriendly, but not fully trusting either. "Mrs. Whitcomb," she said more gently, Do you have any history of mental health issues, depression, anxiety, anything like that? The question stunned me. I knew they had to ask. I knew it was procedure. But hearing it still felt like someone touching a wound that hadn't healed yet. I lost my son 7 months ago, I said slowly. I was sad. I was in pain. But I'm not delusional. I don't imagine things that aren't real. She nodded and wrote something down. Are you currently taking any medication? I took a mild sedative for a few weeks after the funeral, I answered honestly, but I stopped a long time ago. She didn't say anything else, just nodded. But in her eyes I saw something that weighed heavily on my heart. Hesitation. Not cruelty, but the kind of caution people reserve for those who have suffered a great loss, whose memories might be colored by grief. The man returned, holding a tablet. He set it on the table and turned the screen toward me. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, we've done a quick check of traffic camera data near your area. My stomach tightened. Lysan's vehicle, he continued, was recorded at a gas station about 20 minutes from your house, around the same time you said you saw it leaving the lake. I stared at the screen. A blurry image appeared. A gray SUV, the same model as Lysan's, parked by a gas pump. A timestamp was clearly visible below it. That's impossible, I said, my voice higher than I wanted. I saw it, I'm sure. We're not saying you're lying, the man replied quickly. We're saying there's a discrepancy we need to understand. Maybe the camera is wrong, I said, even though I could hear how weak my own words sounded. Or it wasn't exactly the same time. The woman tilted her head slightly. Is it possible you're mistaken about the timing? That the incident happened earlier or later than you think? I opened my mouth, then closed it. I remembered the afternoon light, the angle of the sun on the lake, the ticking clock in my kitchen. But memory isn't something you can weigh against digital data. I knew that. Maybe, I said at last, but I'm not mistaken about the suitcase. Silence again. I saw them exchange a glance. Without a word, I understood what it meant. In their minds, my story was slipping from the realm of certainty into the realm of caution. The man let out a quiet breath. Mrs. Whitcomb, we need you to understand that we have to consider every possibility, especially in a serious situation like this. What about the baby? I asked, my voice trembling. If you don't believe me, what will happen to the baby? My question hung in the air. The woman looked at me, her expression softening slightly. The baby is being cared for, she said. Our top priority is the baby's safety. But if you think I'm mistaken, I pressed, unable to stop myself, if you think I imagine this, then Lysan won't be searched for, and if she really did this... I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't dare. The man stood up, resting his hands on the table. We will continue investigating, he said, but you also need to rest. You've been through a very difficult night. Rest. The word felt absurd. When they left, I remained alone in the brightly lit room, feeling as though I had been removed from the center of my own story. I was no longer the woman who saved a baby. I was a witness, and worse, a witness they didn't fully trust. For the first time that night, I wondered if I truly could have been mistaken, if the light, the grief, the loss had played tricks on my memory. The thought sent a chill through me. If I was wrong, then who was I in this story? But then the image of the suitcase came back with brutal clarity, the weight pulling at my arms, the soaked leather, the faint sound from inside, the icy cold when I touched the baby. Those weren't dreams. They weren't distorted memories. I might be mistaken about many things, but not about the suitcase. I sat alone in the waiting room for nearly an hour after the police left. No one told me where to go or what to do next. I didn't ask. I just sat there, my back against the cold wall, my eyes fixed on the NICU doors, as if staring long enough might let me see through them and know how the baby was doing. An older nurse brought me a cup of water and set it on the small table beside me, gently telling me I should drink something. I thanked her, but I only held the cup without drinking. The water trembled with the uncontrollable shaking in my hands. Time moved painfully slowly, each minute stretching out. I heard medical shoes echoing in the hallway, automatic doors opening and closing, announcements calling patient names somewhere farther away. Everything continued as normal while inside me there was only a heavy emptiness. Finally, a doctor stepped out from the NICU area. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and a calm, measured voice. He studied me for a moment before speaking, as if weighing each word. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, "the baby is a bit more stable now. We're keeping the baby warm and supporting breathing. The condition is still serious, but the baby is fighting." I nodded, unsure I could still speak. My throat was dry, but my heart beat faster with a fragile spark of hope. "We need to run some tests," he continued, "including a DNA test." I looked at him, not immediately understanding. "To do what?" "To identify relatives," he said. "In cases like this, we need to know who the baby belongs to, whether there are any biological family members. That's very important for care and future decisions." I fell silent. Part of me had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like something quietly breaking inside me. I didn't know who this baby was. I didn't know where it came from. I only knew I had found it in a suitcase. "Are you willing to provide a sample?" the doctor asked calmly. I nodded. "Yes, if needed." A nurse led me into a small room to take a cheek swab. The process was quick, almost mechanical. I sat there, watching the swab touch the inside of my mouth, wondering what I was stepping into. I didn't allow myself to think too far ahead. I just followed instructions, one step at a time, as if not thinking would make it easier. Then came more waiting. I left the hospital after it was fully dark, but I didn't go home. I couldn't. I returned to the waiting room and sat there for several more hours, until another nurse gently told me I should go rest. They would call if anything changed. I stood up, my legs heavy as lead, and left the hospital feeling as if I were abandoning a piece of myself behind those doors. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with the lights on, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. Images of Nathaniel filled my mind, his smile as a child, the way he called me Mom in his warm, steady voice as an adult. I searched the final months before his death for any sign I might have missed. Had he ever said anything about becoming a father? Had I ever noticed anything unusual about Lysanne? I couldn't remember, or maybe I hadn't wanted to remember. The next morning, the phone rang before it was fully light outside. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the doctor's voice from the day before said, "Could you come to the hospital? We have the results." I didn't ask what the results were. I just said I would be there right away. I drove in a half-awake haze, the familiar road suddenly feeling strange. When I arrived, they led me into a small consultation room. The doctor was there, along with a woman I recognized as a hospital social worker, and a man in plain clothes I assumed was a police officer. The air in the room felt heavy. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the doctor said slowly, "the DNA results confirm that you have a direct biological relationship with the baby." I held my breath. "Specifically," he continued, "you are the baby's biological grandmother." I heard the words, but my mind couldn't process them right away. Biological grandmother. The two words hovered in the air, refusing to connect. I looked from one person to another, waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake. "That can't be," I whispered. "My son, Nathaniel, he's dead. He didn't have a child." The police officer lowered his head slightly, his voice turning more serious. "According to the results, the baby is Nathaniel's child." I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I gripped the edge of the chair to keep from falling. Images of the suitcase, the lake, the baby's bluish face overlapped with Nathaniel's face in my mind, forming a chaotic blur that made it hard to breathe. "I didn't know," I said, my voice trembling. I never knew Lysanne was pregnant." The social worker nodded. "We only just learned that as well. Based on medical estimates, Lysanne was already pregnant before Nathaniel passed away." Before he died. The phrase pierced me like a blade. I tried to remember the few times I had seen Lysanne during that period. She always wore loose coats, her frame naturally slender. I had assumed it was simply her style. I hadn't asked. I hadn't looked closely. "She concealed the pregnancy," the police officer added. "So far, we haven't found any official prenatal care records." I shook my head, as if the motion could drive away the reality that had just been placed on my shoulders. "Why?" I asked, almost pleading. "Why didn't she tell anyone?" No one answered right away. The doctor cleared his throat and shifted to another topic, though his voice remained heavy. "There's one more thing," he said. "Based on the DNA results and the circumstances, we've shared the information with the police. They've decided to reopen the case regarding your son's death." I turned to the police officer. He nodded in confirmation. "Nathaniel's accident," he said, "was initially ruled as a loss of control on a wet road. But with the new information, we need to re-examine it." "Re-examine it how?" I asked, even as a nameless fear began taking shape inside me. "We've requested a new inspection of the vehicle," he said, "and there are indications that the braking system may have been tampered with." I heard myself inhale deeply, then realized I couldn't breathe out right away. The brakes, tampered with. The words drilled into my head, warping every memory of the night Nathaniel died. "You mean—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "We can't draw conclusions yet," the officer said carefully, "but there is a possibility that it wasn't a simple accident." I closed my eyes. I saw Nathaniel driving in the rain as clearly as if it were happening again. He had called me a few hours before the crash just to ask if I was doing okay. I had told him I was fine. I hadn't known that would be the last time I ever heard his voice. "And Lysanne?" I asked, opening my eyes. "Where is she?" The officer shook his head. "We haven't been able to determine her current location." The room fell silent again. It felt as if the world had collapsed, revealing a deeper, darker layer beneath it, one I had never imagined. My son was dead. I had buried him. I had learned how to live with that pain. And now they were telling me he had a child, that his death might not have been an accident, that the woman I once called my daughter-in-law had hidden everything. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but beneath the fear I sensed something else forming, a hard, cold resolve. "The baby," I said slowly. "My grandchild is still alive, right?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, and we're doing everything we can." I nodded too. In my mind, a truth no one wanted to face was coming into focus. That baby was not an accident. It was the final link in a chain of events I was only just beginning to see. And if my son truly died because someone wanted him dead, then that baby had never been safe from the very beginning. I left the hospital in the late afternoon, my head heavy as if stuffed with stones. What I had just learned didn't allow me to collapse, but it didn't allow me to stand still either. Something had been hidden for far too long, and now it was beginning to surface, piece by piece, cold and sharp. 2 days later, I received a call from the county sheriff. He said they needed to meet with me to discuss some new findings related to Nathaniel. His tone wasn't urgent, but it was heavy enough to tell me this was no small matter. I drove to the police station on a gray morning, the Oregon sky low and pressing down, as if it were bearing weight on my shoulders as well. They led me into a small conference room. A thick folder was already sitting on the table. I recognized my son's name printed on the cover immediately. Seeing that name in bold letters on paper, not on a gravestone or a death certificate, tightened my chest in a different way. A young investigator spoke first. He said they had begun reviewing Nathaniel's financial records from the 6 months before his death. At first, it was standard procedure, but the numbers didn't sit as quietly as they had expected. "Your son had a fairly large life insurance policy," he said, sliding a copy toward me. I looked down. The figure stood out clearly, cold and impersonal, much larger than anything I had ever thought Nathaniel needed. I remembered casually asking him about insurance once over dinner. He had said it was just in case. I hadn't asked more. "The original beneficiary," the investigator continued, "was his wife." I swallowed. Lysan. "But—" He paused, flipping to another page. There was a change. I looked up at him, then at the older investigator sitting across from me. The older man nodded. "About 3 weeks before his death," he said, "Nathaniel updated the policy." I bent back down to read. The legal language blurred before my eyes, but one line stood out clearly. The beneficiary was changed to the insured's biological child, or any child born in the future. It felt as if an invisible hand tightened around my chest. Biological child. Future child. He knew. Nathaniel had known. His will was also amended, the younger investigator said, his voice slower now as if trying not to break me. All assets, the house, savings, investment funds, were placed into a trust for the child if the child were born. I placed my hand on the table to steady myself. In my mind, Nathaniel no longer appeared as the son who always smiled when he came home to visit, but as a man who saw danger approaching and chose to stand in front of it. "That means," I said quietly, almost to myself, "it means," the older investigator finished, "that if the baby lives, Lysan receives nothing from the will or the insurance, not a single dollar." The room went silent. No one needed to say anything else. Every piece fell into place without force. Nathaniel dies, Lysan collects the insurance money. The baby dies, the trust becomes meaningless. 2 deaths, 1 stream of money. I closed my eyes. A wave of nausea rose, not from the grief of losing my son, a grief I had carried for 7 months, but from the cold clarity of the motive now exposed. I had believed my family's tragedy was fate, a slick curve on a rainy night. Now it had the shape of numbers and signatures. "We believe the motive is fairly clear," the investigator said, "at least financially." I opened my eyes. "And the baby?" I asked. "What about the baby?" He met my gaze without looking away. "If the baby doesn't survive, Lysan could attempt to challenge the will. There are multiple legal scenarios." I let out a hollow laugh, the sound unfamiliar even to me. So, the baby was the final obstacle. No one contradicted me. I left the police station feeling as though I had walked through a storm without warning. Everything I thought I knew about Nathaniel's marriage, about Lysan, about the final months of my son's life, everything had been turned upside down. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, yellow lamplight falling over the family photos on the wall. There was one picture of Nathaniel and Lysan on their wedding day. They stood side by side, smiling brightly. I used to look at that photo and think my son had finally found a partner. Now I looked at it as silent evidence of my own innocence. I remembered my last conversations with Nathaniel. He had seemed more tired, smiled less. Once, when I asked if he was okay, he had simply said, "I'm worried about the future." I had assumed it was work stress, family responsibility. I hadn't understood that he was talking about a life not yet born. I stood and walked into Nathaniel's old bedroom, the room I had kept exactly as it was from the day he left home. I opened his desk drawer. Inside were old papers, notebooks, a few bills. I didn't know what I was looking for, only that I needed to touch the things he had touched, as if doing so might bring me closer to him. In an old envelope, I found a copy of the will. I had seen it at the police station, but holding it now felt different. On the final page, next to Nathaniel's signature, there was a small handwritten line, "For my child. So my child will be safe." My tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink. I slid down to the floor, my back against the bed, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry out loud. Not just because Nathaniel was dead, but because he had died while trying to protect his child. The thought was both devastating and suffocating, but it also lit a fire inside me I hadn't known was still there. My son had chosen that path. He had placed his child above his own life and safety, and now that child was still alive, fragile, but alive. I wiped my tears and stood up. I looked around the room at Nathaniel's belongings, and in that moment, something became clearer than ever. If Lysanne had been willing to kill her husband for money and willing to throw her own child into a lake to remove the final obstacle, then I couldn't pretend things would simply resolve on their own. No miracle appears unless someone steps forward to protect what matters. My son had done his part. Now it was my turn. I wasn't an investigator. I wasn't a lawyer. I was just a mother, and now a grandmother. But I knew one thing for certain. That baby existed because Nathaniel paid for it with his life, and I would not allow that death to be meaningless. That night, I returned to the hospital. I stood behind the NICU glass, looking at the baby lying there, tiny among tubes and machines. Its chest rose and fell weakly but steadily. I placed my hand against the glass and whispered, even though I knew the baby couldn't hear me. "Your father did everything for you," I said, "and your grandmother will too." Under the cold white lights of the intensive care unit, I understood that the truth had surfaced not to punish me, but to prepare me for what lay ahead. Because if the motive was this clear, then the real battle was only just beginning. They didn't say it outright. No one walked into the room and bluntly declared that Evan, the baby I had just learned was my grandson, didn't belong to me. That truth came slowly, layer by layer, through carefully chosen words, evasive nods, and forms placed on the table in voices so polite they felt cold. 3 days after the DNA results were confirmed, a representative from the Oregon Department of Child and Family Services came to the hospital to meet me. She was young, neatly dressed, her voice soft. She spoke at length about procedure, about the child's best interests, about evaluations for the future. I listened and nodded, but in my mind, one question repeated over and over: where will Evan be? "For now," she said, placing her hand on the folder, "the baby is under temporary state custody." The words were light, almost gentle, but they slammed into my chest like a door being shut. Under state custody. Not mine, not family, a system. "I'm his grandmother," I said, my voice low but firm. "You know that." "Yes," she replied. "We've documented that, but it doesn't automatically grant guardianship." I wanted to ask why, but I had lived long enough to know the answer wouldn't fit into a single word. It lived in decades of policy, in checklists written by people who had never stood in front of NICU glass, watching a tiny life struggle to breathe. They handed me a list of requirements if I wanted to be considered for temporary guardianship. It was longer than I expected. A full medical evaluation, a criminal background check, a psychological assessment, a home study, in-depth interviews, and finally, a review meeting where I would have no authority, only the right to wait. "Can I see Evan?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. The young woman hesitated. "At this time, visits must be approved individually. The baby is still in a sensitive recovery phase." I understood what that meant. Not yet, or maybe not at all, or whenever it was convenient. That day, I left the hospital without seeing Evan. For the first time since pulling the suitcase from the lake, I truly felt powerless. Not because I was weak, but because suddenly nothing depended on my will anymore. The weeks that followed blurred into a long stretch of paperwork and waiting rooms. I went from the hospital to government offices, from clinics to evaluation centers. I answered questions I never imagined being asked at this stage of my life. "Do you have a history of depression?" "I lost my son," I answered. Who wouldn't grieve in that situation? They wrote it down, nodded, checked a box. Do you have long-term support? I have friends, I have neighbors. They pressed further. Who? Where? Could they commit? During the psychological evaluation, the woman sitting across from me was younger than Nathaniel had been on the day he graduated. She asked how I felt when I saw Evan. I told the truth, that I felt afraid and grateful at the same time, hurt and purposeful at once. She asked whether I thought I was trying to compensate for the loss of my son by holding on to the baby. I stayed silent for a long time before answering. I'm not compensating, I said. I'm continuing. She wrote it down. No reaction. The preliminary results came faster than I expected and colder than I had hoped. I was assessed as not ideal for long-term caregiving. Age. Potential decline in health in the future. Psychological records noting a period of profound grief after my son's death. No younger co-guardian within the immediate family. Not ideal. The phrase clung to me like a label I couldn't peel off. I had raised a child to adulthood. I had worked my entire life. I had survived difficult years without anyone holding my hand. But in front of a checklist, I became a risk. They said Evan would be placed with a temporary foster family once he was stable enough to leave the NICU, a family that was certified, experienced, more suitable in the long term. And what about me? I asked. What am I in all of this? The answer came after an uncomfortable pause. You are a biological relative, they said, and you may apply for supervised visitation. Visitation. Supervised. As if I were a potential threat. I didn't cry in front of them. I saved my tears for the long nights at home when the kitchen was silent and the chair Nathaniel used to sit in was still empty. I sat there thinking about Evan, about the weak rise and fall of his chest, about the tiny hand that had once curled around my finger through a sterile glove. I wondered whether a system could understand that feeling, whether there was a box on any form where love could be recorded. I fought, not by shouting or pounding the table. I fought with the persistence only people who have lived long enough possess. I made phone calls, I wrote letters, I showed up on time for every appointment. I carried every document they requested, neatly organized in an old briefcase. Eventually, they allowed me to see Evan twice a week, 30 minutes each, time, under the supervision of a social worker. I received the notice in a short, emotionless email. When I finished reading it, I had to sit down because my legs suddenly felt weak. The first visit took place in a small room near the NICU. Evan had been moved to a portable incubator, fewer wires attached, his skin more pink. When they placed him in my arms, carefully guiding every movement, I felt something inside me click into place. He was so light that I was afraid even breathing too hard would make him tremble. I looked at that tiny face, trying to memorize every feature. Evan didn't know who I was. He didn't know about Nathaniel. He didn't know about the lake, the suitcase, or the numbers written into a will. But he knew warmth. He knew a heartbeat. When I rocked him gently, he grew quieter, as if that small body recognized something familiar that his mind couldn't yet name. 30 minutes passed with brutal speed. When the social worker told me my time was up, I didn't argue. I only leaned down and whispered a sentence meant for my ears alone. I'm here, I said. I'm not going anywhere. The visits became the only axis my life revolved around. I measured time by the distance between moments when I was allowed to see Evan. Everything else, paperwork, evaluations, meetings, was just noise. Evan was the only reason I stayed upright, the reason I got out of bed every morning, the reason I didn't let myself slide into darkness. There were days I went home and wondered whether I was fighting the inevitable. Whether the system would crush me without mercy, whether one day they would say it was enough and Evan would disappear from my reach forever. But every time that thought surfaced, I remembered Nathaniel, the handwritten line in the will, the truth that my son had not stepped back when he knew he could lose everything. If he hadn't given up, neither would I. I didn't know whether I would win or lose. I only knew that giving up wasn't an option. Not while Evan was still there, still breathing, still gripping my finger with a weak but determined strength. Not when I was the only person in the world who could see the entire story, from the quiet lake to the lifeless conference rooms. On paper, that child might belong to no one. But in my heart, Evan already had a place no official stamp could erase. I was washing my only coffee mug in the sink when my phone vibrated on the kitchen table. The sound was too loud in the quiet house, making me flinch. I wiped my hands on a towel, glanced at the screen once, then turned away. An unknown number. I had learned not to answer calls like that since the day Nathaniel died. Wrong numbers, sales voices, strangers who didn't know how small my world had become. I let the phone vibrate 2 more times, then silenced it. But just as I turned my back, a chill ran straight down my spine. Not a vague intuition, something specific, familiar, as if someone had just touched the house from the outside. I turned back and picked up the phone. The screen lit up again. Same number. I answered before I could think any further. "Mrs. Alara," the voice said slowly, low and calm in a way that made my skin crawl. "You finally answered." I didn't need to ask who it was. That voice, even after 7 months, carried the same artificial rhythm I had recognized the very first time we met. "Lysan," I said. Not loud, not shaking. I surprised myself. There was a soft exhale on the other end, like a soundless smile. "I knew you'd recognize me." My heart pounded, but my mind felt strangely cold. I leaned against the kitchen counter, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Why are you calling?" I asked. "To talk," she replied. "About Evan." The name made my stomach tighten. Evan. She said it as if she had the right. "You have nothing to say to me," I said, "and nothing to do with him." A quiet laugh followed. "Don't pretend to be righteous with me, Alara. I know Evan is alive." The sentence dropped like a stone. Even though I had prepared myself for this possibility, hearing it spoken still knocked my breath off rhythm. "You don't know anything," I said, even knowing how weak it sounded. "I know enough," Lysan said. "I know you pulled him out of the lake. I know the hospital ran tests. I know you're his grandmother. Did you really think that could stay hidden forever?" I closed my eyes briefly. That meant she had been watching, or someone had told her, or worse, she had never gone as far away as I thought. "What do you want?" I asked bluntly. Her voice lowered, slower now, as if she were explaining something perfectly reasonable. "I want what belongs to me." "Evan doesn't belong to you," I said, and this time my voice didn't stay calm. "You threw him into the lake." "That was an accident," Lysan said immediately, without hesitation. I panicked. I had just given birth. I wasn't in control. I let out a dry laugh. "You think I believe that?" "You don't have to believe it," she replied. "You just have to understand that I'm his mother. The law is more on my side than you think." I didn't answer. I walked slowly toward the small desk in the living room where I kept Nathaniel's old voice recorder. A strange habit, holding on to my son's things as if he were still somewhere in the house. I pressed record and set the phone on speaker. "Go on," I said. "What do you want?" "Money," Lysan said without circling it, "and Evan." The bluntness almost made me feel relieved. No pretending, no hiding. "How much?" I asked. "Not how much," she corrected. "Everything, the insurance, the trust, what Nathaniel left for the baby." I swallowed hard. "And if I refuse?" "Then I'll show up," Lysan said calmly, like she was talking about the weather. "I'll see a lawyer. I'll tell a different story. That you panicked, that you made things up, that you stole my child." "Who do you think will believe you?" I asked. "People tend to believe the younger one," she replied. "More stable, less loss." A cold anger rose inside me. Not explosive, but the kind that comes from living long enough to understand the cruelty behind words like that. "You will never touch Evan again," I said slowly. "I swear it." Lysanne laughed. "Don't make promises you don't have the power to keep. I'm giving you two options. Either you hand Evan over to me along with access to the assets, or I make this very ugly." "I'm recording this call," I said, not sure why I said it out loud. There was a pause of a few seconds. I could hear her breathing through the speaker. "You think that scares me?" Lysanne said. "I've survived worse." The call ended abruptly. No goodbye, no further threat, just an empty silence, as if someone had cut a wire. I stood there for a long time after the screen went dark. My hands were shaking, but I didn't sit down. I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to stand up again right away. I called the county sheriff before I could second-guess myself. When I finished telling him everything, there was a long silence on the other end. "You did the right thing by recording it," he said. "This is very important." They came to my house within 40 minutes, 2 men and a woman, all in plain clothes. They listened to the recording twice. No one spoke while it played. "She made a mistake," the female officer said finally. "She contacted you directly." "What do you want me to do?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. The sheriff looked at me, his expression heavy. "We want you to cooperate." "How?" "By continuing to talk to her," he said. "Let her believe you're considering it." I looked at him without blinking. "You want me to be bait?" He didn't deny it. "We'll be close. We'll protect you." I thought about Evan, about the small room where I was allowed to hold him twice a week, about the possibility that one wrong step could cost me him forever. "She's dangerous," I said. "You know that." "We do," he replied, "but this may be our best chance to catch her." I stayed silent for a long time. In my mind, I saw Nathaniel's face, not at the end, but when he was alive, the rare, serious look he had when he had made up his mind. "If I refuse," I asked, "then what?" "We continue investigating," he said, "but she may disappear." I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I had my answer. "I'll do it," I said. The female officer started to object, but the sheriff raised his hand to stop her. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has chosen the harder path. "You understand the danger?" he asked. "I do," I said. "But I also understand that if I don't step forward, Evan will never be safe." They left after dark. The house returned to its familiar silence, but this time it carried a different weight. I sat down in the chair and stared into the empty space in front of me. There are calls you shouldn't answer, and there are calls that, once answered, will never let you return to your old life. From that moment on, I knew I had stepped into a game whose rules I didn't get to set. But if being bait was the only way to end this, for Evan, then I was willing. The meeting was set for a moonless night. The police said it wasn't random. People like Lysanne prefer darkness, the sense of control that comes when others can't see clearly. I nodded and didn't ask more. I had agreed to step into this. There was no room for half measures. She chose an abandoned warehouse by the old lake, less than a 10-minute drive from my house. I knew the place. When Nathaniel was little, he used to take me there, proudly calling it his secret fortress. Later, the building was abandoned. Broken windows, rusted metal roof. No one ever went there anymore. I never imagined I'd return under circumstances like this. The police prepared everything carefully. They checked my car, clipped a small recording device beneath my collar, went over every detail with me. Move slowly, speak little, let Lysanne talk. I listened and memorized it all, but strategy wasn't what filled my mind. All I could see was Evan lying in the incubator, his tiny hand curling each time cold air touched it. I told myself I couldn't afford to make a single mistake. I arrived 10 minutes early. The warehouse loomed beside the lake, dark and silent like a solid block of shadow. A light wind rippled the surface of the water. I parked the car and sat still for a few seconds to breathe. My hands rested on the steering wheel, feeling my heartbeat steady and even. I didn't want Lysanne to see that I was afraid. Another set of headlights appeared at the bend in the road. The car stopped a few yards from mine. The door opened, and Lysanne stepped out. For a split second, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was shorter, dyed dark, her face thinner, sharper. She wore an oversized jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, but her walk hadn't changed. Still that slightly overconfident stride, as if the world owed her something. "You're early," Lysanne said calmly. "I don't like waiting," I replied. She gave a faint smile, her eyes flicking quickly around the lakeshore. "You've always been straightforward. Nathaniel was too. That was both of your weakness." I clenched my jaw and said nothing. I stepped out of the car and faced her, keeping the distance the police had instructed. The warehouse behind Lysanne was pitch black, its door slightly ajar. "Where's the money?" she asked bluntly. "I want to hear you say it all," I replied. "Everything." She raised an eyebrow. "You still think you get to set conditions?" "I do," I said. "Because if I didn't, you wouldn't have called me." A brief silence followed. Then she laughed. "Fine. I suppose you deserve to know." She leaned back against the metal door of the warehouse, arms crossed, her voice slow and measured, like she was reciting a story she had rehearsed many times. "Nathaniel didn't understand," she began. "He always thought everything could be solved by talking. Family, responsibility, children." She curled her lip. "I never wanted that life." "Then why marry him?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Because he was stable," Lysanne replied without hesitation. "Because of the money. Because it meant an easy life. I thought I could tolerate it for a few years, and then everything would be fine." "Until you got pregnant." Her eyes darkened for a moment. "Yes, until I got pregnant. I never planned that." "But Nathaniel did," I said. "He changed his will." Lysanne laughed again, this time unable to hide the bitterness. "Exactly. And that's when I realized I was about to lose everything." She continued, each word clear and unbroken. "Nathaniel discovered the pregnancy, wanted to keep the baby, wanted to be a father, wanted to do the right thing. He talked about the future, about responsibility, about making sure the money stayed with the child. With every sentence, Lysanne felt another door closing in front of her. "I couldn't let that happen," she said coldly. "I couldn't let a child trap my life." "I couldn't let you kill my son," I said, my voice shaking. Lysanne looked straight at me. "I didn't kill him in a moment of anger. I didn't lose control. I planned it." I heard my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "The brakes," she went on, "a small adjustment, a believable accident. Everything would end cleanly." "And Evan?" I asked, my throat burning. She exhaled as if speaking about an inconvenience. "That was the final step. Without it, things would get complicated. I thought, if he didn't exist, everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be." "You call that a solution?" I asked, unable to hold back any longer. "Yes," Lysanne replied without hesitation. "A solution." My entire body went cold, but my hand stayed tight around the small panic button hidden in my palm. I remembered the police's words, "Wait a little longer." "And now?" I asked. "What do you plan to do now?" "Now I want to finish this," Lysanne said. "You hand Evan over to me. You hand over the money. I disappear. You get to live out the rest of your grief-stricken but peaceful life." "I won't do that," I said. Her eyes darkened. "I gave you a chance." In a movement so fast I barely registered it, Lysanne pulled a gun from inside her jacket. The metal flashed under the car lights, cold and terrifyingly real. "I didn't want to do this," she said, her voice perfectly steady. "But I don't have a choice anymore." I didn't step back. I looked straight at her, and in that moment I no longer saw my former daughter-in-law. I saw a stranger who had chosen this path a long time ago. "Evan will never belong to you," I said. My finger pressed hard on the panic button, 3 times, just like they had told me. The sound that filled my ears wasn't a siren, but a sharp explosion that tore through the air. The gunshot echoed off the warehouse walls and dissolved into the surface of the lake, leaving a suffocating silence behind it. I felt a powerful force shove me backward. Everything slowed down for a brief heartbeat. I didn't know where the bullet went. I only knew that in that moment, the line between life and death was so thin I could feel it against my skin. Then from the darkness around the warehouse, red and blue lights erupted and shouted commands shattered the night. I didn't fall right away. I remember that instant clearly, like a photograph frozen inside my chaotic mind. The shot had just gone off. My ears were ringing. The air felt torn apart. I staggered one step, my back hitting the car door, and only then did the pain crash over me, hot, deep, and unmistakably real, spreading from my left shoulder down my arm. I lifted my hand on instinct. Blood. Dark red. Not as much as I had expected, but enough to make my head spin. Then the red and blue lights flared again, ripping through the darkness. Shouting, running footsteps, the clatter of metal. I heard someone yell, "Police, drop the weapon now!" Lysanne turned around. In that brief moment, I saw her face clearly under the lights. No calm left, no confidence. Only fury mixed with panic. Her hand still held the gun, but it hesitated. "Drop it!" another voice shouted, sharper, more final. Lysanne looked around like a trapped animal. Then very slowly she let go. The gun hit the concrete with a dry clatter. Immediately, 2 officers rushed forward, slamming her to the ground and cuffing her hands behind her back. She started screaming, not in desperation, but in curses and threats, as if she still believed she could control the situation. No one responded. I slid down to the ground. My head was spinning, but I stayed conscious. A female officer knelt in front of me, placing a hand on my shoulder, carefully, avoiding the wound. "You've been shot," she said, "but you're okay. The bullet grazed soft tissue. It didn't hit bone." I nodded, not sure I fully understood. My eyes stayed fixed on Lysanne as she was dragged away. She twisted her head back to look at me, her gaze raw with hatred, completely unmasked. "I'll come back," she screamed. "You can't keep him forever." The police car door slammed shut. The sound was final, like a period at the end of a long, dark chapter. I was taken into an ambulance. The light inside was cold and white, the machines humming steadily. The paramedic kept talking to me, asking my name, the date, whether I felt dizzy. I answered slowly but clearly. There was only one thought in my mind. Where is Evan? "When can I see my grandson?" I asked. "You need stitches first," he replied, "but the baby is safe. We've confirmed it." I closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, my chest loosened just a little. My injury wasn't serious. The bullet had gone off course, leaving a long but shallow tear. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky the way they meant it. I just felt alive. The days that followed moved faster than I expected. There was too much to do, too many people to talk to. I met with investigators, prosecutors, lawyers. I listened to the recording again, watched the footage from the officers' body cameras. I signed endless statements. The evidence was too clear to deny. The confession at the warehouse, the recorded phone call, proof of brake tampering, the insurance money trail, the hidden pregnancy. All of it lined up into a cold, logical chain, leaving no room for doubt. The trial came sooner than I ever imagined. There was no television-style drama, no long theatrical arguments. Everything moved like a well-oiled machine, just waiting for someone to press the button. I sat in the back row, my shoulders still wrapped in white bandages. Lysanne sat at the front, dressed in a gray inmate uniform. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. Her face was empty, as if every emotion had long since been burned away. When the prosecutor read the charges, first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted infanticide, I felt each word land heavily in the room. Not because I was shocked, but because what I had known in my bones was finally being spoken out loud, publicly, beyond denial. The sentence was handed down on a rainy afternoon. Life imprisonment, no parole, no possibility of reduction. Lysanne didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only gripped the edge of the bench as if trying to hold on to something already lost forever. I left the courthouse in silence. There was no sense of victory, only a quiet emptiness, like when the storm finally passes, leaving the ground soaked and the sky pale gray. Justice had arrived, but it didn't bring the relief people always promise. Evan was moved to a secure care unit shortly after the arrest. When I visited, he was stronger. His skin was pink, his cry powerful. When the nurse placed him in my arms, I felt the true weight of a life growing, no longer as fragile as the day I pulled the suitcase from the lake. "You're safe now," I whispered, pressing my forehead to his. "No one will hurt you anymore." A few weeks later, I received the temporary ruling from family court. I was recognized as Evan's legal guardian while long-term arrangements were reviewed. The document wasn't long, the language dry, but when I held it in my hands, I had to sit down. I thought of all the times they had said I wasn't ideal, all the forms, the judging looks. And in the end, it was the truth, harsh and painful, that had opened this path. Evan slept in the crib beside me as I read the ruling for the third time. His breathing was deep and steady. I looked at him, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that the future wasn't completely dark. Justice came late. It didn't save Nathaniel, it didn't erase the months of fear, but it came soon enough to keep Evan in this world. And for me, that was everything I could have ever asked for. I brought Evan home on a cloudy morning, the Oregon sky low and gentle, as if deliberately slowing its pace with mine. My small car carried one more life now, and even though everything had been prepared carefully, I still felt like I was doing something both familiar and entirely new. The car seat in the back had been installed by a young social worker who patiently walked me through every step, as if afraid I might forget how to do something basic. I thanked her and smiled, but inside I knew no set of instructions truly prepares you for this moment. When the tires rolled onto the familiar driveway in front of my house, I turned off the engine and sat still for a few seconds. The house stood there. The same old home with its weathered wooden porch, the north window Nathaniel had repaired during the summer he turned 35. I opened the back door of the car and leaned down to look at Evan. He was asleep, his tiny hands curled, his breathing even. I lifted him out, feeling the true weight of responsibility settle into my arms. As I stepped over the threshold, I realized the house had been silent for far too long, the kind of silence left behind by a place once full of voices, then suddenly stripped of its rhythm. I placed Evan in the new crib by the living room window where the morning light filtered in softly. I stood there watching him, and suddenly the room felt like it had gained another breath. Old age and a newborn are not a gentle combination. I understood that on the very first night. Evan woke at 1 a.m., then 3 a.m., then 5 a.m. I fumbled with the bottle, counting each scoop of formula like I was solving a difficult equation. My back ached. My knees crackled when I bent down to lift him. There were moments when I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking, wondering if I was pushing myself too far. There were moments of suffocating fear. I laid Evan down in his crib and stared at his chest, waiting for the rise and fall. I checked the room temperature, checked the locks, checked everything so many times that even I could feel myself wearing down. Every small sound outside the porch made me flinch. Every night I slept half awake, ready to spring up at the first sound of his cry. But alongside the exhaustion were moments of healing I never expected. Evan has a small habit. When held close against my chest, he lets out a very soft breath, like a tiny sigh of relief. The first time I heard that sound, I stood completely still for minutes, afraid to move. I realized then that it wasn't only me holding him. He was holding on to me too, in the only way a baby knows how. In the mornings, when sunlight touches the curtains, Evan opens his eyes and looks around with a seriousness that's almost funny. Once he looked at me for a long moment, then slightly curved his lips. Not quite a smile, just the faintest change. But my heart tightened. Nathaniel had that same look when he was little, the look of someone weighing the world before deciding to accept it. There are details that hurt so much I have to turn away. The way Evan wrinkles his nose when he's displeased, the way he grips my finger with surprising strength, even a small mark on his chin, a trace so much like Nathaniel when he turned 2. I don't try to find my son in Evan, but Evan brings those things with him, like an unavoidable reminder. The house slowly came back to life in very tangible ways. The sound of the bottle sterilizer replaced the long silence. The living room light turns on at midnight, no longer to illuminate loneliness, but to make sure a small life is safe. I started opening the windows more often, letting fresh air flow in. I hung the family photo back on the wall, not to cling to the past, but to put it where it belongs. I learned to ask for help. A neighbor brought over a pot of hot soup on my 3rd day home. An old friend came to watch Evan so I could sleep for an hour. I used to think asking for help meant admitting weakness. Now I understand it's the only way to keep going. Some nights I sit in the armchair, Evan asleep on my chest, and I feel something very strange. Imperfect peace. I still think of Nathaniel every day. The pain hasn't disappeared. It's only shifted, making room for a new purpose. I no longer wake up just to get through the day. I wake up because Evan needs me. One afternoon, while I was changing Evan's diaper, he suddenly laughed. A short, high, clumsy sound. I froze, then laughed too, tears spilling without warning. I thought of Nathaniel, of my son's first laughs. And for the first time, that memory didn't bring only pain. It carried continuation. I am no longer alone in the way I once thought was permanent. Loneliness doesn't disappear entirely. It changes shape. It becomes the quiet after Evan falls asleep. It becomes the time I sit by the window, looking at the still lake in the distance, no longer trembling like before. I learned to live with it, without letting it swallow me. Sometimes, when I'm so tired I want to sit on the kitchen floor and cry, I wonder if I made the right choice. Then Evan wakes up, needing me, and the question fades. Not because I have a perfect answer, but because I have something to do. I began making very small plans, a regular medical schedule, a foster parent support class the social worker recommended, a small corner of the garden to plant flowers in the spring. These plans aren't promises for a distant future. They're stakes driven into the present, keeping me upright. This house has witnessed too much loss, but now it also witnesses a beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, just day by day, night by night, the steady breathing of a child growing up safe. When I hold Evan by the window on a quiet evening, I whisper to him, not expecting him to understand. "You have a home," I say, not because everything is okay, but because we will make it okay. The house is no longer a place where I live alone with memories. It becomes the place where I learn to keep living, without denying the pain, but without letting the pain define the rest of my life. And in Evan's steady breathing, I find the sense of purpose I thought I had lost with my son. No longer alone, not because loneliness vanished, but because, at last, I have someone to walk with, even though the road ahead is still long. Time doesn't arrive like a great wave that washes everything away. It comes slowly, day by day, quiet and patient, like water soaking into dry earth. Evan grew that way, not suddenly, not loudly, but steadily, so much so that sometimes I only noticed when a shirt had grown too tight, when the once fragile cries turned into curious babbling sounds. Evan is healthy. That is the first thing, and also the most important. The doctors said his lungs have fully recovered, with no lasting effects from those early days between life and death. Every time I hear that, I nod and say thank you, but inside I whisper a different thanks. a thank you meant for Nathaniel. My son never lived to see this, but I believe he traded his life so Evan could have that chance. Our mornings start early. Evan wakes when the first light slips through the curtains. No alarm needed. I learn to shape my rhythm around his. Meals, naps, small playtimes on the old rug in the living room. I thought I had forgotten all of this after Nathaniel grew up, but it turns out the body and the heart have their own memory. My hands know how to support his head. My voice naturally lowers when I rock him to sleep. I am mothering again, not to replace the past, but to carry it forward. When Evan began to say his first words, I knew I would have to face a question I had postponed for a long time. He asked it naturally, one quiet afternoon, as we sat together on the porch, watching leaves fall. "Where's Dad?" Evan asked, his voice small but clear. I took a slow breath. I had prepared for this moment, but no preparation is ever enough. I didn't want to lie. I also didn't want to place a burden on a child. "Your dad was a very good man," I said. "He loved you, even though he never got to meet you." Evan tilted his head, thinking, "Where is Dad?" "He's in our hearts," I answered, placing my hand on my chest, then on his. "And in the good things he left behind." I tell Evan about Nathaniel in small pieces, appropriate to his childhood. I tell him about a man who liked fixing things around the house, who liked laughing when he solved a difficult problem, who liked sitting by the lake fishing on quiet afternoons. I don't tell him about the warehouse, the gun, the cold water. Those truths will come later, when Evan is old enough to understand without being crushed by them. The past is still there. There are days when I open a drawer and find something of Nathaniel's, his old watch, a note he wrote, and the sharp pain returns, as vivid as the first day. But it no longer controls me. I don't let it decide how I live that day. I learn to place the pain in its own space, to respect it, without letting it steer my life. I am stronger, not in a loud way. My strength comes from getting up every morning, even when my back aches, from signing another stack of legal papers, even when my hand is tired, from facing the curious looks of strangers without needing to explain everything. I no longer feel the need to prove anything. I know I'm doing what's right. Some evenings, when Evan is fast asleep, I sit alone in the living room, the warm yellow light falling on the photos on the wall. Nathaniel on his graduation day, Nathaniel on his wedding day, and now Evan in oversized pajamas, smiling at the world. I look at those three images and see an unbroken current. My son is no longer here in flesh and bone, but his love remains, clearer and more tangible than ever. Evan is proof of that. Every time he laughs, every time he falls and stands back up, I see Nathaniel there, not as a ghost of loss, but as part of a life that continues. I don't have to imagine it. I only have to look. Someone once asked me, during one of those rare conversations, if I had any regrets. Regret for not turning away when I heard the sound by the lake. Regret for stepping into a dangerous chain of events. Regret for choosing the hardest path. I answered immediately without thinking. No, I don't regret it. Not because everything ended perfectly, because it didn't and never will. I don't regret it because if I could return to that moment, I would still run down to the lake. I would still pull the suitcase out. I would still choose Evan, no matter the cost. Time does not erase blood ties. It doesn't make me forget Nathaniel, and I don't want to forget him. It only teaches me how to carry that memory without collapsing under it. It teaches me that love doesn't end when someone is gone. It changes shape, finding another way to exist. When I hold Evan by the lake on a peaceful morning, the water calm as if it never witnessed tragedy, I whisper something only I can hear. "Your dad brought you here," I say, "and I'll stay for as long as I can." Evan doesn't understand everything. He only grips my hand tightly as children do. But in that grip, I feel a bond time cannot erase, a thread woven from blood, from choice, from unconditional love. I lost my son, but I did not lose my ability to love. and as long as Evan grows up. In those arms, I know I am living, not in the past, but in its meaningful continuation. I still remember that moment clearly, even though enough time has passed for everything around it to change. The lake that day was not violent at all. It was still, almost gentle, reflecting the pale gray sky of what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. If someone had looked from a distance, they would have seen nothing but calm water, a few small ripples, and wind moving through the trees. But I know that just one step more, and I could have turned away if I had chosen to stay in the kitchen, pretending I heard nothing, if I had convinced myself it was just a harmless sound, not worth an older woman like me taking a risk. If I had chosen familiar safety over a vague instinct, just one different choice, and everything would have gone down a path with no return. If I had turned away, Evan would be gone. There would have been no suitcase pulled from the water, no faint breathing heard in that decisive moment, no emergency call, no ambulance lights, no long days in the hospital, no sleepless nights of fear and hope. Evan would have been only a name no one ever knew, a life erased before it could exist in anyone's memory. And so would I. There are losses that don't kill you immediately, but leave you living on like a shadow. If I had turned away that day, I would have lived the rest of my life with a question that never had an answer. Every time I looked at the lake, I would have wondered, what if I had run down? I would have carried that weight to the end of my days, heavier even than the pain of losing Nathaniel. People often think courage means having no fear. The truth is different. I was terrified. I was afraid of falling, afraid of the cold, afraid of facing something too terrible to endure. I was even afraid that I might be wrong, afraid it was all a misunderstanding that would make me look foolish. But love was stronger than that fear. Not loud love, not the bravery of the young. It was the quiet love of a mother who had already lost a child, who understood that some things, if you don't do them in that moment, you never get another chance. It was love without promises, without guarantees, simply the force that pushes you forward even when your legs are shaking. That love was stronger than age. I've heard many people talk about the limits of old age, that we should slow down, stay safe, let others handle difficult things. Maybe they're right in many cases. But age does not take away the ability to choose what's right. It doesn't erase the responsibility of the heart, and it certainly doesn't make love weaker. There are days when I'm very tired. My back hurts. My hands shake. Some mornings it takes me longer to get out of bed, but not once have I thought I was too old to love, too old to protect, or too old to do what needed to be done. That love was also stronger than evil. Evil often appears reasonable. It has reasons. It has motives. It calls itself a solution. Lysanne believed what she did was necessary to protect her own life. She chose to erase whatever stood in her way. But evil, no matter how many layers of logic it wears, cannot withstand the light when the truth is pulled up. Just like that suitcase years ago forced to rise to the surface. I didn't defeat evil with strength or exceptional intelligence. I simply didn't turn away. I chose to run toward the sound, toward the thing that frightened me most. And that choice changed everything. Now, when I stand by the lake on quiet mornings, I look at the water without trembling as before. I don't forget what happened. I don't want to forget. But the memory is no longer an open wound. It becomes a reminder that in this life there are very brief moments when your choice determines not only someone else's fate, but how you will live with yourself afterward. Evan runs around the yard, his laughter filling the air. He doesn't know his life once hung on a few seconds. He only knows there is a home, a pair of arms, and a world safe enough for him to grow up in. And that is enough. I chose not to turn back, not because I was certain I would win, not because I thought I was stronger than others, but because I knew that if I didn't step forward, I would never forgive myself. There are choices you can't redo. And looking back on the road behind me, with all the loss, the fear, and even the small miracles, I know I chose right. Not because of the outcome, but because of the reason I walked forward. If you're still here, listening all the way to these final lines, I want to thank you, not as a viewer, but as someone who has walked with me through the entire journey. Tell me where you're watching this story from, a busy city, a small town, or a quiet place you call home. And I want to ask you something, honestly. If it were you, in that moment by the lake, when everything was still uncertain and frightening, would you run toward the sound? Or would you turn away, like so many of us have done in life? Leave a comment. It doesn't have to be long, just real. I read every line, and I believe your story deserves to be heard too. If you see yourself in this story, in the fear, in the choice, in unconditional love, please press like and stay with me by subscribing to the channel, because there are still many stories left untold, and maybe one of them will help someone out there find the courage not to turn back.